I'm Lynn Fraser. I'm here with Kay Vout, who's a psychologist at the Kiloby Center, and we're here with Robert Weiss. Robert, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. I'm a recovering sex and love addict for about 31 years. I entered the rooms of S meetings in 1985. And I saw as a part of my recovery that the next step for me was going to be trying to help people. And so that combined with HIV/AIDS and my seeing the relationship between sex addiction and people getting ill and back in the late 80s, early 90s really led me to join the field. And so I got my social work degree and I opened a clinic after working for Pat Carnes for a number of years. I learned in residential treatment really everything I needed to know from the outside in about sex addiction. I already knew the inside out part. And then opened a clinic in 1995 in LA for sex addiction. And I didn't realize at the time it really was the first outpatient intensive structured program in the country for this work. And I ran it for almost 20 years. During that time, I've written 8 books on the topic of tech and sex and intimacy and relationship and sex addiction. And I love writing, and my life has come to life because I'm in recovery. And so I get to share that every day in the media. I get to share it in my writing and my blogs and in the different treatment centers that I now oversee or run. Because, you know, if you do something long enough, people actually think you know something, and now I get to run things instead of just sort of starting them myself. So it's been quite a ride. I will say this to the recovering people who are listening, that my favorite piece of literature in the 12-step, all the content that 12-step literature offers is the promises. Because I can tell you as someone with sexual issues, who had a lot of abuse in childhood, that the last thing I thought I would ever be talking about in public was my sexual behavior or other people's sexual behavior or sexual recovery. My life was so compartmentalized into who I wanted you to see over here and what I did sexually over there, that when the promises came along and they told me I was not going to be ashamed of what I had done, that I was not going to want to hide what I had done, that actually was going to be something that I could use to help other people and I would no longer want to hide. I was like, right. But I stand in front of thousands of people and talk about sex addiction and what my history is and how I understand the issue to be. I write books about it. I think the promises do come true. And so, you know, I'm very, very grateful to be here.
That's great. So do you have a quote or saying that guides your work or that means something to you?
Well, there's a bunch of them. I mean, what I would say to any woman who's experiencing an affair or a male spouse who's cheating on her is, I'll tell you, this is not a quote, but it's a fact. It is never your fault. Never, ever. I don't care if you haven't enough sex with him, if you're overweight, if you don't like him anymore, it doesn't matter. If he wants to go do something and he's unhappy with your relationship, there are many, many choices you can make other than cheating. That's what I'd say to all the ladies who get cheated on, because inevitably you guys are going to blame yourselves no matter what. I'm not thin enough or whatever. I have some basic beliefs in recovery. I think, you know, what goes around comes around, and you're accountable for your behavior, and therefore behavior has consequences. So you can do the F-its, which is the kind of the fuck-its, like I'm going to go do what I want to do, and I'll drink and I'll use and I'll whatever, but know that you will have to pay the consequences at some point. And that's something that I think everyone in recovery lives with. So behavior has consequences is one of my favorite sayings. Another one is really that a life well lived in recovery should really be just one notch above boring, because I think that that's what a life well lived is. It's a little bit of good and a little bit bad and some really fun times and a couple of really bad times, but mostly it's just kind of even. And, you know, and that's not how addicts live. You know, we like intensity, we like drama. And when you find yourself in intensity and drama, you're not living in recovery. That's a simple thing, because life lived in recovery should really just be one notch above boring. Doesn't mean like difficult things don't happen, but I try to keep myself on a path with as little drama as possible.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. So when you first started in this field, you talked about the 80s and 90s and then going to school. What was available at that time for treating sex addiction, porn addiction? Anything?
Well, there were individual therapists who Pat Carnes had trained or worked with, who understood how to do the work. Or those of us in recovery who had studied with Pat or studied his work, and because of our own recovery, we knew something about the work. But that was it. There was a small cadre of maybe 15 to 30 therapists in the United States that I knew because they would come to the same conferences and I would see them all the time. And it wasn't really until we turned the tide of internet porn and internet sex in the in the early 90s, that we started to see an escalation of problem sexual behavior. So, you know, I think I would have had a small, interesting practice with guys who had sexual problems had the internet not come along. But because it came along, I all of a sudden had people flooding in with porn problems, with hookup problems, with the fact that this highly pleasurable content and experience was so immediately available without any real forethought, as it was in the past, has left more people vulnerable. And I'll just give an example, and then I'll stop. I mean, back in the day when I was younger, if I wanted to go have sex, you know, and I was a healthy person, I had to go to a bar. And I would go to a bar and I'd put on a cheap shirt and some bad cologne. I'd look around to see if anybody looked back at me and gave me some vibe, and maybe we'd start talking, and maybe we had something in common, and maybe we didn't. And maybe my best friend who knew I was dating someone else saw me in the bar and said, what do you know, now what I do if I want to have sex, I just pick up my phone and I click on my favorite app, or have a date, you know? And so for those who struggle with impulse disorders, who seek to dissociate or space out or get into pleasurable intensity of any form rather than dealing or having, or those of us who don't have the ability to deal with what's in front of us. And so we turn to pleasure and distraction as a source of making ourselves feel better or not feeling anything at all. When the internet came along, it just escalated the problem because so many more people had immediate access. You know, if I wanted to look at porn in the 80s, I had to go to some icky place under a bridge that had sticky floors and spend money that I didn't have to buy stuff that half the time I had to return because it was a video and they were expensive. And what about now? I just pick up my phone and I say, Siri, you know, show me some porn. And in 0.34 seconds, I have access to not just a magazine or a video as in 25 years ago. Now I have access to complete unlimited library forever of images that never end. And so, of course, like gambling, you know, where you sit at blackjack and you have the card thing that never ends. It's not like they ever run out of cards when you're, you know, playing blackjack. Well, guess what? They never run out of porn now. And you can go 24/7 just like a casino. So what has happened is for those people who are vulnerable to using intensity and pleasure as an escape, they found themselves increasingly hooked on internet porn, internet sexual hookups, internet prostitution, and all the things that simply weren't available just a few years before. And of course, that has escalated as we've gotten more mobile. And now you're not just sitting in front of a computer. Now you have your phone, your laptop. You can be anywhere in the world. You can be connected anywhere, anytime. Of course, it's harder to help people work with it because life online is so ubiquitous. Everybody sort of has to be online on some level. And yet that's like walking to the drug dealer's house for lunch every day. You know, it's just not an easy thing to handle. So these are the kinds of things that I'm facing now. And yes, with a much larger audience because the problem is much larger.
So what is your approach? How do you help these people?
I actually tell them how terrible they are, how shameful they are, how horrible people they are, and they really just don't deserve to live. No, I'm sorry. I have to put a little levity in because if I don't, sex is hard to talk about. And one of the things I think that makes me a good speaker about sexual issues is that I'm not afraid to talk about the hard stuff, but I always make people laugh a little bit. You know, if you're asking what treatment is about, I think, first of all, people who come to treatment for sex and relationship addiction are done. Like they are toast. They've lost their marriage or their second marriage, or they've been trying to date somebody for more than a month forever and they can't do it because they keep seeking out anonymous sex, or they can't tolerate long-term intimacy because they have early trauma, which is really what underlies most of the issues I treat is early complex trauma. What treatment is taking that person who comes in to see me or to one of our programs who is saying to me, hey, Rob, you know, and really what they're saying is, I'm not sure I want to stop the sexual behavior, but I do want to get my wife off my back, or I do want to stop losing jobs, or, you know, what every addict wants when they go to treatment. They want their consequences to go away. And my job while they're in treatment is to begin to explore how sexual they've been and where they've been sexual and how they've been sexual and what their entire sexual life has been, not in a shaming way at all, but to simply put it on paper. Hey, let's look at what you did and what you've done. Now let's look at your life. You're married, you have kids, you're a gay guy, you have a relationship, you know, and how you want to live your life and how you've chosen to live your life based on your values and your beliefs and who you are. How do those things match up? And how has your sexual history led you astray from wanting to be in that relationship or wanting to pursue that degree, but you're too busy looking at porn to study? You know, how has the casual sex interfered with your having more long-term committed gay or lesbian relationship, whatever the issue is that they want their goal in life, kids, family, education, or something in work, we're going to take a look at how their sexual behavior has interfered with or violated really their goals and beliefs for their life. And the thing about being an addict, as you well know, is you're really not in the moment thinking about all of your behavior, all of your history. You're only thinking about what you just got into or just got out of. So treatment is a lot about looking at, well, I know that porn is a problem for you, but let's look at all your sexual life. Or I know that having affairs is a problem for you, but let's look at porn, let's look at hookups, let's look at, and we often find there's a lot of behavior there, and that there's a lot more than has been going on than what simply brought them into treatment. And once we lay that out, then they often move into shame. Oh my God, how could I do this? This isn't who I wanted to be. I've destroyed my life. I'm sleazy, I'm pervert, all that stuff. And that's my job to rush in as a therapist and say, no, it's not who you are, it's what happened to you. I don't think you intended to ruin your marriage, hurt your children, lose your lover of 20 years, and not be able to get a job. I don't think that was your goal in life. But I do think that you learned some lessons around emotional survival and trauma based on your history that led you, depending more, let's say, on behavior and on excitement and leaning into that for support than leaning into people. I loved the concept of chemical dependency, because I think that what addicts are seeking is something that is dependable and reliable, that will make them feel the way they want to feel, and not make them feel the way they don't want to feel. And when seen in that light, it doesn't really matter whether you're seeking sex or gambling or drugs, or it's all about using something to depend on to make yourself feel better, to escape and get through the day. The problem is that what healthy people depend on is other people. Healthy people depend on friends, they depend on community, they depend on partnerships where there's trust and honesty and everything about them is known, and this is not how most addicts grow up. So a big lesson that I have to teach them when they move into shame is, these are survival skills. I know that you feel badly that you hurt your wife. I know you feel badly that you ruined that relationship. And I'm sorry that that behavior has consequences, and you're going to have to suffer the consequences of that behavior. But that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. That doesn't mean you're a sleazebag. That doesn't mean that you are a pervert. It means that sex and sexual attachment and sexual pursuit and sexual intensity and sexual fantasy are ways that you learn to survive. And we're going to teach you in treatment how to stop depending on intensity and fantasy as a way of feeling better and start depending on people like the ones you're in treatment with and me. And my belief is that good treatment, especially good residential treatment, when it's done right, and the older I get, the more I understand this, many of my clients are taught what it's like to be in a healthy family for the first time. I'm 56 years old, and I got to tell you that I'm still learning why my husband and I would rather be alone than have friends over, why we don't look forward to holidays. It's because of how we grew up. Now at 56, I'm still learning that having a few people over on a holiday to have a meal and play cards is actually fun. And that inviting people into your life and building community and building close relationships where you are known is not only survivable, but is additive to my life. Because growing up, what I learned was stay away from people, don't trust them, handle it on your own, let people see the part of you that they might like or want to see, and avoid the parts that they wouldn't like, because above all, you want everyone to love and value and appreciate you and not know about the bad parts. And that's how many of us grew up, surviving in environments where we had to look good or do what we thought would please our caretakers, but not necessarily knowing a lot about what met our own needs, or which is often about, by the way, connection, relationship. I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown. I'm a huge fan of looking at the need for relationship and connection as a primary survival skill as much as we need to eat or be sheltered. The last thing I'll say before you ask a question is, because I feel strongly about this, is, when we come into the world, and in our first couple of years, if we don't get fed, we don't survive. If we don't get a place to put our head, we don't survive. And guess what? If we don't have love, nurturing, stimulation, and appropriate holding and mirroring and comfort and all that, if we don't get that from our caretakers, there is also a profound loss to the person, and maybe they don't survive either. Many a child has died due to infantile depression or failure to thrive because they were fed and changed, but no one loved them. And now I don't want to be loved now the way I was loved when I was 4, or might have been loved when I was 3. I don't want you to pick me up in the air and say coochie coochie coo and cuddle me and throw me around and pat me on the head. That was what love was if I had had it then when I was 2. Now as an adult, I still need to eat, I still need shelter, and I still need more sophisticated adult forms of love, like appreciation or connection, or to feel valued, or to feel understood, or to feel a part of, and that's how I feel loved. So to me, this is the basic problem with addiction, is that addicts grow up learning that ultimately people can't be depended on. You have to handle problems and issues on your own. And how do you do that when you're 3? You dissociate, you use fantasy, you read a million books, you go somewhere else to find pleasure and comfort because your immediate world doesn't offer you that. And that's a survival skill. Unfortunately, adult life, when you want to have intimate, meaningful relationships, that doesn't really jive with being by yourself, trying to feel better alone. It only leads to addiction. And so to answer your question, the biggest part of what we do is get people socialized.
But I was wondering if you could talk a little about the effect on the spouse or partner who's left alone with addiction.
Sure. So most often, but not always, the spouse of a sex addict is female. And I run a program at the ranch in Tennessee, and have run other programs where we have women's programs. And I can tell you that women come into sex addiction treatment not indirectly. They come in through eating disorder treatment when someone asks the right questions about their adult sexual history. They come in through drug and alcohol treatment when you notice that they don't want to talk to that nice female sponsor you introduced them to, but they can't wait to get the cute guy behind her. So women come in through failed addiction treatment, through failed eating disorder treatment, through challenges with trauma, when a therapist takes the time to look at their adult behavior. And by the way, and I am getting your question, Kay, but all too often my experience is that when people come into treatment, even for sexual trauma in early life, we don't ask them about masturbation. In adult life, we don't ask them about affairs. We're so invested in talking about the trauma with some concept or belief that working on the trauma will heal their adult life, that we often don't ask them the very questions around sex, intimacy, and relationship that an addict and a trauma survivor may be acting out but won't tell anybody that they need help with. And so the women are least likely to come forward with this because we already know what the culture says about a woman who's having a lot of sex, right? She's a slut, she's a whore, she's whatever. And of course, women have already internalized this, so they don't go to someone and say, I have a sex problem. The ones who come to therapy will say, I have a problem with relationships, or I can't seem to meet the right guy or woman, or, I always seem to end up in these bad situations in dating. And then when you do a history, you find out, oh, well, that's because you have sex with everyone that you see, or, that's because you date 5 different people at the same time, or, So I want to say something about the women, and because we do have male spouses and they go through a lot of pain and heartache, but it is primarily female spouses that we see in treatment. So so the spouses are most often wives, girlfriends of heterosexual men who have been living in some kind of marital or committed relationship where they often have kids, and they've been together for 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, whatever. And this guy has been, because of early trauma and abuse, acting out all over the place sexually, and he has hidden it from her so well. And even when he isn't hiding it well and she questions him, he lies, well, I never did that, I was never doing that. So she ends up really, as I think most spouses of addicts end up being kind of crazy people, because when you live with a crazy person, you're going to become a crazy person if you're deeply involved with them. We actually have a diagnosis for this, by the way. It's called folie à deux. It means that if you are highly psychotic and paranoid and you're deeply involved with someone who isn't, that over time, that deeply involved partner will also start to become paranoid and think they're seeing things. Because when you live in close dependency with an intimate partner, you start to take on some of their characteristics. And I think that is actually kind of a cool thing. In fact, I'm working on a book, you'll like this, with a friend of mine named Stephanie Carnes, Patrick Carnes' daughter. And the book is called Pro-Dependency. That's P-R-O dependency. Because I have a great interest in talking about how I'm not really a big fan of things like of the concept of codependency, for example. And I still, hey, I promise I'll get to the real spouses issue, but what we found in my field, and I'm really planning on extending my writing and talking about this into the general addiction field and caretakers in general. I don't understand why when, let's say, a wife of 8 years, her, she's been a frog in the boiling water, her husband only drank a little bit or she only knew about a little bit of drinking early on. And then by the time they're 8 years in and have 2 kids, he's a solid drunk. And she's, counting bottles and, trying to make excuses to his boss and working double time to cover everything he's not doing at home and worried sick about him for years. When he finally gets sober, we turn to her and we say, well, let's talk about your problem. Let's talk about your family history, why you married this person, why did you exhaust yourself? How about love? Like, who wouldn't, if you love your family and you love your family members and you're committed to their health and welfare, who wouldn't give yourself up in order to make sure that they thrived? Even if that means letting your own life fall apart. That's, I think, healthy love. If your partner had cancer, if they had, a profound heart condition, you would work double time to make sure they were cared for and the home, and everyone would say, good for you. But somehow when you do that, when it's an alcoholic or a drug addict or some other kind of addict, someone says, oh dear, you're codependent, you're enabling, you're Al-Anon, and I just don't like that. So one of the things I'm working to do is say, whether codependency exists or not, it's a later term issue. In the beginning, when someone comes in and they've been living with an addict, especially a sex addict, but any addict, I'll tell you what they need and what they don't. They don't need to talk about their family history. They don't need to talk about their history with this addict in terms of their behavior or their history, because the minute you start talking to a partner of an addict about them, they who are already thinking, God, isn't there something I could have done to make this better? Now you've told them, oh yeah, if we look at your family history and your history with your husband or wife, we can absolutely see all the problems and mistakes that you've made and all your problems. And then, and by the way, that's called codependency and you need to go to Al-Anon, blah, blah, blah. And guess what? They never come back. We have lots of problems with spouses of addicts getting them into treatment. And as therapists, we often say, oh, those spouses, they're so difficult. They just want to point a finger at the person who did this to them and get them fixed. And I think that's an excuse on the part of therapists who have not done a really good job of being invitational and supportive to spouses who are hurting, who have poured their life on the line to try to help somebody or a family survive, and they're exhausted and they're overwhelmed. And a part of them feels like they haven't done a good enough job or it would have been fixed. And what we need to do is love them, support them, thank them for their hard work, help them understand that they have been victimized in this situation. I love Al-Anon, but to say don't be a victim, it's like, well, that's nice for the future, but let's talk about the last 8 years where this person's been lying to you, manipulating, telling you they're not where they are when they say they are, hiding bottles or hiding sex partner or whatever it is. And so, taking a more pro-dependent, positive dependency approach for spouses, validating their losses and their trauma of living with this person and trying to make it better and having not been able to fix it. I think if we give that a year, maybe they might want to talk at some point, if it occurs to them, about how they landed with this person or why they put up with this. But I think to come at partners at the beginning with a self-examination or a label is not good treatment. And so to come back to your question, Kay, what I do with partners of sex addicts and love addicts is I don't tell them to not look through his emails. I don't tell them to not look through his cell phone bill. I don't tell them to stop doing detective work. I don't tell them to stop reading every book on recovery they can, because first of all, I know they're going to do that anyway. It doesn't matter what I say. And second of all, if their goal as a couple is to regain trust, and that's what's lost in sex addiction relationships is trust. The only way trust is going to be regained is by that person understanding they're in the doghouse. They're one down because they've cheated on you. They've lied to you. They've been drinking all the time. They haven't been meeting their family responsibilities. And you have been suffering as a result of that. And you shouldn't trust them. When a spouse comes to me and says, well, I want to know where he is 24/7 and I want to track her on his phone because he used to be with prostitutes. He used to be having an affair, all that. I don't say, well, dear, that's a little codependent of you. He has to work on his recovery for himself. I say, where can we get the software? Because if the goal is for her to begin to trust him again, he's not going to say, oh my God, I can't believe she wants to track me. Like, how sick is that? He's going to say, as the therapist says, of course she wants to track you. She wants to be able to trust you again. And why should she trust your word since your word has not been true for so long? She needs your actions to be trustworthy, and that's going to take time. So in the meantime, you're going to have to be accountable to her. You're going to be one down. You're not going to get your way. You're going to have to come home on time. And I just wrote a book about this, which is by the way, I have to say to your folks, a fabulous book on women who've been cheated on and on men who've cheated on their women. And it's called Out of the Doghouse. And it is literally a book explaining to women and validating, to your question, Kay, that they have every right to be furious. They have every right to not trust. And when that guy comes back to her and says after 90 days, are you going to get over it? I mean, come on, give me a break. You've been angry for months. And she says, well, hold on a second. You were cheating for 6 years and I'm supposed to not be angry after 90 days? That doesn't add up. As a therapist, my job is to support her and say, you be as angry as you need to be, just don't hit him, and don't make any threats that you aren't going to carry through on, like say you're going to leave when you're not. But other than that, you can be angry, you can kick him out, you can go sleep in the other, whatever you need to do to feel safe and to begin to grow trust again. So the big answer to your question is that I have a much larger vision for what the partners of addicts need than to be told to look at themselves. I think they need a lot of validation for having supported and loved their family, for having had the hope, for having held out the hope that things will get better for the whole family. That's what we do as therapists. We hold hope for people who are hopeless. Well, that spouse has held the hope for those kids and that addict alcoholic that things are going to get better. And so I'm not going to call them names. I'm going to validate them, support them. And I think spouses of addicts, most of all need, it's kind of like they've been hit by a truck. Once the person goes into treatment or once they find out what's been going on, especially with sex addicts, and they suddenly realize, oh my God, he was having an affair when we were on a honeymoon. He was sleeping with my best friend. And the last thing they need is investigation or blame. They're horrified. Their whole life has been turned upside down. Their hopes for the future, their thoughts about who their partner was and what they shared, that's all demolished when that guy says, well, yeah, I did have 3 affairs and I have seen a few it's gone. And what's gone is trust. So for that man who has been drinking or using or sexual acting out or gambling with family money, the answer for you is to be non-defensive, to own that your behavior has consequences, which will, I promise, go on far longer than you want them to. And you got to eat crow for a while because you've really screwed this up. And yes, you screwed it up because you had early trauma. Yes, you screwed it up because it was survivorship. Yes, you screwed it up because it was the best you could do. But you're still responsible for it. And if you want to be with this man or this woman, you've got to clean this up. And it's going to take a while, maybe a year or longer. So my goal is to validate spouses, to give them, especially women, empower them to feel like it's okay to be angry for as long as they need to be angry, empower them to feel like they don't have to forgive right away or anytime soon, and also to give the message to the guy that if you want this relationship back, you have a lot of work to do. And it's going to be things you don't necessarily want to do. Now you're going to have to be a fully participating member in this coupleship, in this family, and you're one down on the trust level. And you're going to have to earn your way back to trust by being on time, by calling when you're going to be late, by telling her what you're doing, by explaining things honestly and truthfully so that she can regain trust. So my message is to the partner is good for you. You survived this horrible situation and you still love him and your family or her and your family. Now let's honor you for what you've been through and support you toward regrowing a new relationship if that's what you choose to do.
Question, you mentioned how people that are hooked on porn are going for the thrill, that there's a chemical reaction in the brain, there's the dopamine, there's the excitement, all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And we've also been talking about internet and porn addiction being so available. I have young grandsons who are 9 mm-hmm. and 10 years old, and I know that that's in the world now. How would you talk about, I guess there's 2 parts to this. One is, what effect does that have on someone's sexuality as it's starting to form and they're exploring their own sexuality? And then the second part of it is, and then how do you actually treat someone who's addicted to that kind of mental brain stimulation?
This is a great question because I've been doing sex addiction treatment, and of course I am myself a sex addict. I've been looking at this issue and dealing with adults with this issue for almost 30 years. But in the last 6 or 8, really since social media has started to really roll out in about 2007, 8, we have a new population. And I'm not sure that I can call them sex addicts because we don't have enough research. what I can say is that they have what I would call them is porn dependent. Meaning, so here, let me explain the difference. To me, a sex addict is someone who had early trauma around intimacy, relationship, attachment, sexuality, family life. They learned there wasn't anyone to depend on except themselves. They used fantasy as a means of dissociation and survival. Maybe they were sexualized in some way through covert or overt incest or something that went on in their world that they never told their parent about because it wasn't safe. And so they're sexualized at an early age, and they have a lot of early trauma, and they don't have a lot of trust in people. And so they turn to highly intensive sexual behavior and romantic behavior to try to feel a sense of connection when everything they learned growing up tells them connection is scary and will hurt you. But what we know is that without connection, you don't survive as a human. You don't do well. So that's the challenge for an addict, is I need to depend on people, and I need to depend on relationships, and I need to depend on care and trust and love, but I don't trust the people who might give it to me. And that's a client I've been seeing for 25 years. That's the person I am. I mean, I had a mentally ill parent, and my mother was psychotic and bipolar from the time I was 2.5 or 3. She was in and out of hospitals. I had that kind of childhood. I learned about sex as a means of self-soothing and fantasies, a means of survival at 3, at 4, at 5. But now we're talking about a different population. We're talking about a population that maybe didn't have that childhood. Maybe they grew up in a reasonably healthy family. Maybe they grew up in a reasonably healthy environment, but maybe they're a little shy, or they have a few social issues or whatever. And guess what is the hardest, most emotionally challenging time in terms of relationships and social and being social in your life, period, the end, is being 13 to 16. You know, high school is the hardest time. You got to be picked for the team or not. You got to get a girlfriend or not. By the way, there's a fabulous and very painful but amazing series about teen suicide called 13 Reasons Why on HBO. And you watch this young woman who's already passed away. She's already committed suicide. She created a series of tapes explaining to each person who hurt her in high school, who led her to make that decision. There's a tape about each one of them, and there's 13 tapes, and that's why it's called the 13 Reasons Why. And to watch someone go through the world of being a teen today, or even when we were teens, it's just hard. And kids are mean, you know, they're clicking, they're weaning each other out, they're in power struggles. That's part of being a teen, is that a pecking order, that figuring yourself out, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
What if you're not up for that? What if you don't know how to do that? What if you're not good at that? What if you find some porn at 11 or 12 and wow, that's really fascinating, and wow, that's really exciting, and wow, it feels connecting? Because that's the thing about sex addiction, or versions of using sex as a form of connection. It does feel like you're connecting. You're talking to someone, or you're looking at images, or you're feeling excited about those images or that person. And so it can feel like it can take the place of. Bottom line is, I see young men in particular, and some young women getting involved with porn at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, 16. Some too early, some, you know, it's not too early, but the problem for them is that they choose the porn over people. It's easier to do the porn than try out for the team. It's easier to do the porn than, you know, try to get to be a cheerleader. It's easier to look at the porn than it is to try to get a girl to date me or whatever. And so rather than getting picked on or not being part of the clique or being told you don't want to go to the prom with me, I'm just going to look at the porn. And so I come home from school and I'm looking at porn, and then I'm not getting my homework done. And then I get into school or college, and then my default mode for social relationships is looking at the porn. And so what I think we have is a small percentage of our young people who have opted out of building intimate social relationships for whatever reason. Maybe it's their issues, maybe it's the environment they're in, who knows. And, you know, they start that at 13, and all of a sudden they're 23. They've never had a date. They've never had sex with a real person, or only very casually. They have no idea how to build an intimacy relationship or date someone. But they sure know how to look at porn. And by the way, the men who have these issues have been looking at that porn for 5 years, starting at 17, and now they're 22. They don't even get erections when they have sex with a young man or woman their age, because they are so hyper-stimulated, what I would call dependent on the high level of stimulation that the porn provides, that just being with a person not only is anxiety producing, but it's not stimulating enough for them to get an erection or get aroused. And so these people have learned by the time they're 22 that the only thing that turns them on is porn. And those people look like a sex addict, right? Because they're not dating, they're not really with people, just using the porn or webcam kind of situations to be sexual, and yet their life is not progressing because they're not dating, they're not doing well in school, they're not doing well in their first job because their default for support and stimulation and comfort is porn. However, unlike your traditional sex addict, my experience is if you take the porn away from that 15 or 16 or 8, well, if you take the porn away from that 22-year-old who's coming with a problem, and you say, you're not going to be looking at porn anymore, we're going to commit to that, but you are, and we're going to commit to this too, going to have to join that baseball team at work. You're going to have to go join that speed dating club, and actually meet people to date. And I get them out, push them literally, like a good parent, out into the social world. They start liking that because now they're old enough and secure enough in some ways that they're not, they're not 15. They're not as vulnerable even. And they find that they like being on the team, or they like dating, or they like making friends. And what's interesting to me about that population is they don't put the porn aside and start seeing sex workers. They don't put the porn aside and start having affairs. That was what a traditional sex addict would be. If I told a traditional sex addict, someone who has early complex trauma, to put down the porn, they would just pick up some other form of sexual stimulation. They would start, doing something else. But these young men and women are not, it seems to me they're more dependent. The porn is their go-to place when they're uncomfortable, but they have matured developmentally. They have solid attachment. So they can bond and build relationship, and they're not as tied to returning to the sexual behavior because their needs start getting met in real life. This, what I would call porn-dependent population, we don't have any research. I mean, we barely have any information about them or research. So, I am very cautious about wanting to call them sex addicts, because my experience of a sex addict is someone who, when you tell them to put this down, they don't just start getting better. They need a lot of intensive work about socialization, about trauma, about isolation, about triggers. They really are addicts. But these 16, 15, 14, these people who picked up porn in their mid to late teens, and all of a sudden that's all they've had since they were 16, and now they're 22. I think that a lot of them are much more intact and able to carry on their lives with good instruction and boundaries. And if I found one of them wasn't, I might begin to say, well, maybe they do have early childhood experiences, and maybe we need to look more closely at that. But what I don't want to do is over-pathologize a 15-year-old who's been looking at porn for a couple of years, missed the team, missed the dating, and now has become dependent on the porn. But if you put them in the right circumstances and take the porn away, they'll start growing and maturing without necessarily, let's say, having to go to 12-step meetings or having to have 3 years of therapy. They may not need all of that because their injuries are later and their deficits are later. So that's kind of how I look at that population. And we just don't have enough definitive research for me to say, well, this is who they are and this is what they need. But I think to call them sex addicts is premature and kind of undermines the work that I do with sex addicts, because these people are much more easily helped.
So
wait, I'm sorry, Lynn.
No,
I want to say something about kids.
Mm-hmm.
So kids and porn. I'm not Gail Dines. I don't think that porn is ruining our generation, ruining our kids, is completely against women and women's value. I just don't believe that. I think there were people who said that alcohol was ruining our culture, ruining our people, ruining our young adults. And then we got this thing called prohibition in America. That didn't work so well. I don't think you can take people's pleasures away from them, gambling, gaming, sex, alcohol, drugs, and then tell them that, they just need to get by. People, even healthy people, like distractions. Even healthy people like to have a drink or two occasionally, or even get drunk. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with alcohol or they're alcoholic. So the idea of banning porn or seeing it as being the enemy, I just don't ascribe to that, because I do believe that most people have porn in their life and it's not a problem. Just like most people have a drink or occasionally go to a casino, or most people do pretty well with healthy pleasures. It's just the vulnerable, whether they're vulnerable at younger age or they're vulnerable at a more adolescent age, the vulnerable who turn to pleasure as a form of escape, those people need help. Do I think our 8, 9-year-olds should be looking at porn? No, absolutely not. I don't worry necessarily about the 16-year-old boy who's looking at porn, because the news is, I hate to tell you this, and every 16-year-old boy is looking at porn. We've tried to do research in Canada and in these states, looking at kids who look at porn versus cohort groups, sample groups of kids, let's say 100, mixed male and female, who don't look at porn. And guess what? We can't do that study because we could not find 30 kids in America who weren't looking at porn, no less 100. So when I go to an audience, I talk to therapists. I'm like, so how many of you guys think your kids aren't looking at porn? I mean, you know that all your clients' kids are looking at porn, but how many kids are your? And every therapist says, oh, no, 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 not my kid. And I say, well, think again, because every child is looking at porn. Everyone. They may not feel good about it. Their parents might be against it. They may have only looked at it once or twice, but they're looking. And by the way, we looked at porn too. You know, we didn't have unlimited access, but somebody had Dad's Playboy. Somebody was at a sleepover and passed some magazine. You know, we had access to it too. It just wasn't in the same form. So, do we need to find ways to limit porn access to people who are under the age of 13, 14, 12? Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. Is that going to happen? I doubt it. Because I don't see that, you know, I mean, if I have a smartphone, it's just my thumbprint that makes it work. Well, you know, I can figure out how to get my dad's thumbprint on a phone. You know, I mean, kids are going to find it if they want to. What I think is missing and what is absolutely essential is education. And I don't put this on the schools because I think the schools educate our kids just like they should. They teach them what makes, you know, what the birds and the bees are. They teach them how to get sexually transmitted diseases and about pregnancy and all that stuff. They're teaching them the facts of human sexuality. That's what school is for. But what I say to the adult population who's listening is that our kids are getting their sex education from the pornographers, and that's our fault. Because every parent, I don't think a parent any longer has a out about talking to their kids about sex. I think every one of us has a responsibility now, no matter what your faith, no matter what your belief, to sit down, and there are lots and lots of books, how to talk to your kids about online content at 8, how to talk to them about online content at 10. You know, we have books for every age group now. There's no excuse for a parent not sitting down, at least with an 11-year-old for sure, and saying, hey, you may see some of these things online. Let me tell you what they are. They're adult entertainment. That means that just like when you watch Star Wars, there really aren't lightsabers. Well, there really aren't people doing that much in the real world, but that's what porn is. It's like a movie. So, you know, and adults sometimes use it for entertainment, but they don't expect themselves to be having that kind of sex, nor do they expect their partners to be like that. So let me, as mom or dad, tell you what sexuality is in a relationship. Let me tell you what sexuality, if they were really brave, what sexuality is for your mom and I in a healthy way. You know, we loved each other, we cared about each other, we saw this as fulfillment of our whatever. In other words, kids learn about sex at school and they see sexual behavior being carried out in pornography. But it's us, it's parents who have to teach them that sex and intimacy go together. And that this is how, in an intimate relationship, you develop sexuality. And this is what casual sex is. And if we're not willing to do that, then we are giving up our responsibility about what our kids are going to learn to the pornographers. Because for sure, they're going to learn, I mean, they're watching porn, they're masturbating to porn, they're going to think that's what sex is. And believe me, if you watched I Dream of Jeannie and Star Trek all day, you would think that there were genies in bottles and, you know, people landing on other planets because that's your reality. Someone needs to say, oh, that's, you know, not real. And in the world that we live in today, which has a lot of trouble separating what is real and what is fake, it is really up to a trusted parent to say, I got to tell you, kid, that may look exciting, but that's not the real thing. And if we don't do that, then we are going to have a problem. And we already do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
How's that for a speech?
Well, it's fascinating. And so when you're dealing with someone who comes to porn through earlier childhood trauma, complex developmental trauma, then you would work on the trauma first and not.
No.
How does that work?
No. There's a great statement that I wish they had taught me in graduate school. I wish I could tattoo it on the forehead of every therapist backwards so they see it in the mirror in the morning. And this is the statement for every therapist who's watching. Behavioral problems require, capital R, require, behavioral forms of treatment and intervention. So if you are working with someone who is depressed because their parent died, or they don't know which job to take, or they have a history of, you know, dropping out and not committing, or they don't know about if it's a psychological, social relation, whatever, you can do whatever form of therapy you want. You know, you can do Jungian, you can do trauma-based, you can do EMDR, I don't care. But if someone comes into you and they tell you they're cutting on themselves, or they're drinking, or they're using, or they're sexing, and it's interfering with the functionality of their life, then I become a cognitive behavioral therapist. Then it is upon me as a therapist to step in with contracts and agreements, just like if someone said they were suicidal. If a client says to me they're suicidal, they taught me day one, well, you know, you sit with them, you understand, do they have a plan? What would that be? You make contracts with them, you sign things. It's exactly the same when they come in saying, I have a behavioral problem with the casino, with the porn shop. Then we have to make behavioral agreements and start holding you accountable to them so the behavior will stop. My expectation is the most extreme behaviors, sexual behaviors, when I'm doing treatment will stop at the end of the first session. And we're going to make that agreement, and you're going to call me every night during the first week and tell me how you did. And, you know, in other words, I'm going to begin to build this idea in you that when you make these sexual decisions or drug and alcohol decisions, you're really not alone. You're accountable to me because you said to me you weren't going to do it. And then you went out and did it. And so when they do it, I'm going to confront them. In other words, the behavior with addictions and behavioral problems, the behavior has to be addressed first, because the person is, number one, they're not available for therapy, because anytime anything difficult or uncomfortable comes up, they just go look at the porn or find a prostitute or go drink. So what are you really building or working on in therapy if they just return to that default mechanism to get better, to make themselves feel better? And in addition to that, that default mechanism, which is seeing the prostitute or playing blackjack or eating or spending, that has consequences. And so what's going to happen is over time, your client is just coming in with more shame, more job losses, more financial problems, and then you got to deal with all that, and you never get to the problem. You have to understand that addicts and people who act out sexually or, you know, in an addictive way count as addicts, that we don't have strong affect management skills. We don't have strong self-containment skills. If we did, we wouldn't turn to heroin to feel better. We wouldn't turn to compulsive masturbation. We would turn to people. We would turn to comforting relationships because that's healthy. Addicts don't do that. So I can't raise someone's anxiety in therapy by talking about trauma when they don't know how to not see a prostitute if they drop a pencil. You know, my clients need in the beginning of treatment to gain what we call affect management skills, or the ability to tolerate their feelings and examine their feelings, the ability to self-soothe and comfort themselves. And most of all, in my world, they need to have established social relationships that are non-sexual with people they can turn to for support. So I know as the client gains what I would call ego strength or a stronger sense of themselves, and they gain distance from the behavior, whether it's drinking, using, sexing, whatever it is, and they grow their social support around not doing it, then they start coming in and being more stable. Then they come in and they say, I know a client's ready to do trauma work, for example, when they come in and they say, you know what, I felt like going through that red light district on Thursday, and instead I called my sponsor and I drove the other way. So what they're saying to me there is, I had the impulse, but instead I thought about it. I thought of you and our work, and instead I did what you said, and I reached out to someone and I didn't do it. That tells me that they have begun to incorporate and internalize and begin to manage the behavior problem on their own. And that allows me to step out of this sort of containment role, this confrontation role, this managing the symptom role. And I can step back and say, oh, good, you're managing the symptom with your social support and the emotional growth you're having. Now we can start to look at what has driven that symptom. I will say this, and I think it's important to say, there are people who can't stop their behavior. You know, they just can't. You can see them 3 times a week, you can get them on medication, you can have them in 12 support meetings a week, and they just can't because they don't have the sufficient internal ability to support themselves through that stage, or maybe they have other addictions that are occurring, like alcohol or drugs or other things that leave them vulnerable to other forms of acting out. When I have someone who has multiple addictions and I can't get them to stop, and I've used all the tools at my disposal, which is more sessions, evaluating for medication, going to more support groups, getting more homework, checking in with me more often. I only have so many things that I can do to help someone outpatient. And when they get to a point where they're still drinking and using, they're still acting out sexually, they're still risking their life or putting their goals at risk on a daily basis, and I've done everything I can to try to intervene, then I think, well, maybe they need to be in a safer place. That's why we have treatment centers, so that they can be in a place where they really can't act out that behavior. They can't leave, they can't get on the computer, they can't do it. And they're faced with all the feelings that come up around that with no place to escape, because all around them are people who just want to love and support and nurture them, and they can't act out. And so what's going to come up is all of the stuff that is of the trauma. I do believe in residential treatment, by the way, that you can start trauma work because you have someone really contained and really supported, and you're feeding them and you're helping them get through the day and you're helping with their laundry. And they, you know, they're kind of, residential programs are a little bit like bringing someone back to childhood. You know, you are reparenting them. You are holding a space for them to be with their family of peers while we take care of the hard stuff, like making sure they have a bed and making sure they're fed and making sure their day goes well, and supporting them and nurturing them and keeping them in that safe family. As I said at the beginning, I think treatment and recovery is some of the places where my clients, for the first time at 40 or 50, may experience what it's like to be in a healthy family, where people listen to you, where they don't shame you, where they interrupt you when you're about to hurt someone else's feelings and help you find a different way to say it so you don't alienate that person, where you learn how comforting, supportive it is to be surrounded by people who care about you, who know everything about you and love you anyway, just like healthy parents. And my experience is when you build that kind of therapy environment, clients learn lessons that they will never forget. I will say this to you and I will shut up. When someone goes to treatment in a place that I run, I know they've done well because for the next 6 months, they don't call me once a week, they call each other. My clients will leave treatment and say, I want to stay in touch with the people I was in treatment with. And they do. They form like Skype meetings. I have clients who 6 or 8 at a time will form a Skype meeting and they'll talk once a week or once a month for a year, because that's where they came to find their primary bonds within their family of peers. You know, to me, a successful outcome of treatment is not that they feel that they trust and love their therapist. To me, a successful outcome of addiction treatment is that they trust and love the community that they know they have to be a part of in order to survive. That can be a faith-based community. It can be a therapeutic community. It can be a clinical community. It can be a 12-step community. But they need to know that they need other people to turn to on a regular basis who know and love them and understand them other than a therapist or a wife, but people who get them, get their stuff. You know, I mean, this is why, you know, I will stop, I promise. This is why I am such a strong believer in 12-step recovery. You know, I don't care if you don't believe in God or the big G. I don't care if you don't like parts of it or you think parts of it don't apply. What happens in 12-step meetings is you go to a place over and over again, you raise your hand, you talk about really difficult things, people listen to you, and then afterwards they come up and they give you hugs and they give you their phone number and they ask you out for coffee. And basically you get the opposite experience you got growing up, which is it's good to talk about my problems. And when I do, people embrace me and they support me. That lesson needs to be in real time learned over and over and over again, because when an addict is reduced by stress or difficult circumstances to a really, to being vulnerable, as any emotionally challenged person is when they're under stress, they're going to revert to their behavior unless they have those people around and they keep those people around that they can comfortably reach out to for support rather than depending on the substance or the behavior. They will depend on people. So no, I don't do trauma work in the early stages, but I do want to know enough about their trauma to be able to say, right, so you're not a bad person. So you're not, you didn't mean to hurt your spouse. You didn't mean to ruin your life. But because of the things that happened to you, you ended up making choices that aren't healthy ones for you in your adult life. I want the trauma to do shame reduction in the beginning so I can help say this happened to you and that's why you're like this, but not to explore in a deep way, because in the beginning they don't have the tools or the ability to tolerate that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At least with sex addicts.
So what's your sense of, you've worked with a lot of people, what's your sense of what it is that some people recover and go into recovery and some people don't?
Mm.
Do you have a sense of around willingness or readiness or?
Sure. You know, I do think to an absolute, I believe it's absolutely true that addicts are in denial about the damage they're causing or how important their life situations and people are. And so they will say, I'm fine and I don't have a problem, maybe at the loss of a marriage, maybe at the loss of their reputation, and they will keep drinking or using or sexing because they think they're fine. And so I know that addicts can often tolerate a lot of losses, a lot of pain before they, as you said, become, I'll use the word motivated, to want to create change in their life. I think they're willing, but they're not motivated. Like they'd like it to happen, but they don't necessarily want to put it down. Now, there are some people who are, I think there are people who don't, there are certainly people who are so wounded, or maybe some of them were born this way, that they can just roll over their circumstances and say, well, I'll just move on to the next marriage. I'll just move on to the next, they don't form attachments. They don't feel badly about having hurt or let down people. And I can't really help those people, they don't need my help. They don't really care about what's happened. They're just going to move on. And I have to accept as a therapist that there are people who don't have the emotional skill set or the psychological ability to recover. They are built in a way that because they maybe don't have remorse, or they are so wounded in some way that they can't see beyond themselves, or maybe they have biological challenges like they're on the spectrum, or they have some kind of mental illness, and they may not to be able to recover from addiction, nor may they be ever made to be willing enough. So the reason I say that is because I think sometimes we take someone and we push them about how much they've ruined their life and they've hurt these people, and we kind of really try to make them see, gosh, if you just stop doing this, your life would be so much better. And some people can suffer as a result of that. They don't need reminders. They don't need it shoved in their face as much as maybe traditional addiction counseling has done. On the other hand, we also have to accept that there are people, no matter how much we push in front of them, they're not going to want to change. And so, I truly don't think, as much as you and I would like to, Lynn, be able to say, oh, well, it's the person who has the red right ear that's going to recover and has the blue left ear that's not. The reality is it still comes down to relationships and community. It comes down to how much is that person suffering as a result of losing their connections, feeling disconnected, not being a part of, having secrets, living a double life, and having all these consequences. Does that cause them pain, and do they want that pain to stop? And can I instill in them enough hope that if they stop that the rewards of community, relationship, connection, and healing will be greater than the immediate reward of their using or acting out? Those people I can help. But I can't help everyone. Not everyone will hold on to that hope, and not everyone really cares whether they have consequences for their behavior or not. And those people really, they're on their own.
So, yeah, as far as diagnosing these people with a clinical diagnosis, aren't they just having sex and having fun? And what's your idea about that? Why are we criticizing them and labeling them as sick?
This is a really important question, because people in the sexual health community, who I admire so much, because, they said, we're not going to exclude homosexuality as being unhealthy. We're not going to exclude fetishism as being unhealthy. The sexual health community fought very hard for people whose behavior in the bedroom was private and didn't hurt anybody to be non-pathological. And I think that they really get, and especially for me as a gay man, they get a big vote of my appreciation. But when sexual health becomes exclusive, and you start to say, but those people can't be sex addicts, or those people can't have a problem, then your work at expanding the field starts to work against you. Because while some in the sexual health community might say, well, any kind of consensual sex that someone has and they choose to have is perfectly fine. And if it hurts their relationship or it hurts well, that's their choice, And because I have an addiction background, I think, and a trauma background, I think to myself, well, that sounds right, but I know so many sexual trauma survivors who have become sex workers, and they're not particularly happy being prostitutes, or they may be very defensive about their being prostitutes, but they did it maybe because it was an easy way for them to survive, and they didn't mind having the sex they were having with these people or being paid because of what happened to them at an early age, so they kind of fell into it. But to say that just because every sex worker is consensually agreeing to sex, that it's a joyful, happy experience for them, or that everyone who's been sexually abused, who chooses to have sex with 100 people a year, is happy with their sex life, I think misses what happens when our early child attachments and development are profoundly compromised. And when that happens, some of us make adult choices, even around sex or eating, which are naturally occurring functions, that are not healthy for us. That even though we say, yes, I want, what do you say to the person who's 350 pounds or 400 pounds, and they say, I want a gallon of Haagen-Dazs a night. Okay, go ahead, but don't come to me with your diabetes problems and your, so I would say it's the same person who has, if you want to see prostitutes 3 times a week and, have affairs when you're in relationships and look at porn, every other hour or whatever it is, and your spouse goes along with that and that works into your lifestyle, I don't care. None of my business. But if your sexual behavior is not leading you toward your larger goals of family, community, career, education, children, then we have to take a look at it, because you have bigger goals than just getting laid, but your getting laid seems to be getting in the way. So, the bottom line is, when any pleasurable behavior, first of all, everything is not an addiction. Some people say, oh, well, can't anything be an addiction? Now everything's an addiction. No, there's something to be an addiction. It has to be highly pleasurable or produce profound emotional shift because of the consumption of it, So people, for example, who are compulsive, who check the stove every hour to make sure they turned it off, or wash their hands 4 times a day because they have anxiety or fear, and if they keep washing their hands, they're less afraid that they're going to back. People have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders. Those people are also alleviating anxiety through their behavior, and they're also making themselves feel better and distracting themselves. But no one could say that washing your hands 12 times a day is a fun thing. No one can say that checking the stove 15 times brings pleasure, but drinking, using, eating, sex, those are highly pleasurable activities that can become addictive because the person gets addicted to the pleasure piece. But the consequences of all the rest of it are much greater. And so, I disagree with the concept that everyone who has a sexual experience with another consensual person or with themselves is necessarily doing something sexually that is good for them, or that they will feel good about later, or that they really feel good about in the long run, even though it is consensual. In particular, those people who have trauma and abuse in their history, who make decisions that ultimately aren't good for them, but it's what they do because it's what they learned and what they know from a very dysfunctional environment growing up. And they don't know any better. So in that way, they're kind of like emotional kids. I wouldn't say to a 14-year-old, sure, go see as many prostitutes as you want, and, look at as much porn as you want, because I would be concerned about their life. And I know that someone may be a president of the United States, or a highly functioning professional, or a doctor, or, a fireman, and they may be able to carry out their life, but their life is deeply diminished because of their emotional challenges. They may be intellectually intact, but emotionally vulnerable. And that emotional vulnerability will bring down their intellectual ability. In other words, intellect is great until you get emotionally empty, and then it goes out the window. And you're going to drink and you're going to use, because even though you know better, you're going to do your behavior because you're trying to fix something emotionally that can't be fixed by thinking. Yeah. Hope that was helpful, Kay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's excellent.
So Lynn, any roundup questions? You guys have any final?
Yeah, so the question that we're interested in for people who are watching or listening in particular is, if you've got someone who's getting in touch with the fact that they have a problem, they have an addiction around sex or porn, or maybe they know somebody who does. But in particular for the person with the addiction, what would you suggest would be some really key elements in moving towards recovery?
Well, to be a little self-serving, but nonetheless accurate, I would direct them to my website, or tell them to go to Amazon and find me, Robert Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, on Amazon. I've written 8 books on the topic. So if you want to understand the very basics of sex addiction, like what could this be, and how could this be an addiction, and how could my 22-year-old have this problem, or how could my wife or girlfriend, read Sex Addiction 101. I wrote a very basic 5th grade level text on that any sponsor could give to someone and say, hey, you might want to look at this, or any therapist who, even if they're not really familiar with sex addiction, say, here, see if you identify with this.
And what's your website? What's your website address?
Oh, my website is Robert Weiss, my name, MSW, which is my degree, .com. So it's ROBERT WEISS MSW.com. But Sex Addiction 101 is probably, I really think at the moment, the best introduction to the topic. It does talk about porn problems. It talks about women who are sex addicts. It talks about trauma and spouses, but not in depth. There is a workbook that goes with that, Sex Addiction 101, the workbook. So if you wanted to start doing the work with a sponsor, or you want to look at it for yourself or bring it to a therapist, you can begin to do some writing and see what comes up. For spouses, I would read Mending a Shattered Heart, Stephanie Karn's book on partners. I think Out of the Doghouse is a very good book for spouses to understand their role in having been violated by a spouse who's having sex that they're not telling them about, or relationships they're not telling them about. So the first key is education. I think the family and the person have to read it, and they kind of have to buy into it. Like, oh yeah, this might be true for me. Because if you don't think it's true, or you don't believe in what your healing process is, or the person who's helping you, you're not going to get better. So I think first you need to say, yeah, I think based on what I'm reading and I'm learning, whether it's my books or Pat Carnes or other things online, this looks like what the issue is. And then you need to go to see, and then once you've done your reading, or as you're doing your reading, I would absolutely suggest some 12-step meetings, whether it's Sex Addicts Anonymous or Sexual Compulsives Anonymous or Sexaholics Anonymous. There are a bunch of them. And if you don't feel like you want to go into some church basement in your neighborhood at midnight to go to a 12-step meeting or 9 in the evening, almost all of them have meetings online now. So, and I love that, because when I do treatment in Tennessee at the ranch, which is where our treatment center is, I have my clients going to a Wednesday night meeting online every week, because number one, I don't want to drag them in the van an hour into town, an hour back. They got to go to the meeting. That's a drag. You can't do that too many days a week. But also because I know that if they go to that online meeting while they're in treatment, they can go home to Chicago or New York or Namibia, and they will, or wherever, Ethiopia, and they can still go to that meeting and see those people. And that's one of the follow-through things that gets missed in residential treatment, is you recover with all these people that you love and you appreciate and you feel close to, and you're going to these meetings you're getting used to, and you know those people, and then you go home 1,000 miles away and you don't know anybody, and you're supposed to recreate this environment. So I think the idea of seeking out and finding online support, every Friday night, California time at 6 o'clock, I'm on a site called intherooms.com, and I can't recommend it highly enough. In the Rooms, literally intherooms.com. They have 160 12-step meetings a week online. So AANACAMA, 12-step sexual recovery, gambling, it's all there. And you can sit there and not even show your face. You can be a black screen and have a fake name, but you can listen to what people are saying. And you can hear how they're talking about it. And you can hear how that process goes. And, one of the things I've noticed, I do a show about sex, love, and addiction every Friday night at 6 o'clock on In the Rooms. And anyone in the world can go online and go to In the Rooms and sign in and find me there talking and answering questions. And like this, there, instead of the 3 of us, there are often 60 to 100 people there. And they're from Dubai, and they're from Japan, and they're from India, and they're from New York. And they're saying to me, I have these sexual issues and I don't know what to do about them. And we're all talking about it. And an hour before, at 5 o'clock California time on In the Rooms, there's an SAA meeting. So you can find information, you can find support groups, you can find therapists. I think, when Pat Carnes was leading this field in the way he did, who wanted to go into a bookstore and buy Out of the Shadows, for a book about sex addiction? Who wanted to read that book on an airplane? Who wanted to, go into church when the only meeting that night was the sex meeting, But now, and these are the advantages of our tech world, and there are many, many. I don't devalue the tech world at all. New problems, new solutions. There are so many places you can go to get help, so many places you can go to get information. Virtual reality, for example, is being used now for porn and soon for sex. Already a little bit for sex, meaning live sex partners through virtual reality glasses. But guess what? At the University of Houston, they've been working on virtual reality relapse prevention for 8 years. So you put on a headset, a goggle like Oculus, and that person feels like they're in a bar. They smell the alcohol. They hear the people talking. So what virtual reality can do, yes, it can put you virtually in a sex situation. It can also put you in a virtual situation where you're in a therapist's office and you feel like you're walking to the adult bookstore, or you feel like you're in the drug dealer's house and you smell the cigarettes and all that, but you're really in your therapist's office. And so when your heart starts to beat faster and you get all excited about what you're going to do, they can help you, as we say in the field, down-regulate. They can help you shift your mood state, help you breathe, help you come up with alternatives in real time with a situation you're being presented with that seems real, but it's really virtual. So there are many tech and online and internet-related ways that people can find help, even before they might be ready to go see a therapist. And then when they are, I do recommend trying to find a CSAT or someone who is trained in sex addiction treatment. Dr. Carnes has a certification. It took me over a year to get certified, and I now supervise people. We have about 2,500 CSATs around the United States, and that's someone who's trained to treat sex addiction. So they're not going to say to you, oh, just have a little more sex, or just don't feel so ashamed, it'll all be fine. They're not going to say to a spouse, oh, well, you're just too conservative. Your husband can look all porn he wants. they're going to take the problem seriously, and they're going to address it and evaluate for it in a way that is focused on the problem. And I think it's important to have a specialist for when you have a special issue. You know, if someone is found to have cancer, I don't expect them to go to their GP. They need to go to a cancer specialist. And if they're found to have a problem with sex and addiction, they probably should go see a specialist in sex and addiction. And that's what CSATs are. So education, involvement in communities and places where you can hear other people talking, you realize you're not the only one. And you also hear people whose behavior is changing, and you hear how they've done that. Meeting with therapists who are experts, being in group therapy where you're with other addicts and other people who have this problem. Faith-based groups where you can go to church and be around other men or women and be less ashamed because you shouldn't have this problem if you believe in God. Well, guess what? People who believe in God have problems too. And they can even go to their church and have a men's support group or a women's support group around sex and relationships where they can talk about this. The most important thing is that I think people in recovery have to find a way to be unafraid to tell their story and get help. You may have ruined this marriage. You may have ruined this job. You may have destroyed getting through college in this particular place. But if you don't get help, you're going to ruin the next marriage, the next relationship. You're going to get through school. You know, you're just going to end up deeper and deeper and deeper. So, you know, having the motivation and the willingness to step up and dip your toe in the water with books and then online and then in real time with people, I think is the progression.
That's wonderful. It sounds like there's actually a lot of people who are in recovery from sex addiction. It's not
Yeah.
a hopeless kind of a situation.
It feels hopeless because it's so shameful. You know, I mean, our culture's kind of reached the point where I think a woman can say to her neighbor, you know, who she's friends with, and maybe they have kids of the same age, she can say, you know, my husband just went into treatment for drinking, and you kind of know, you've seen him at some parties, and that neighbor's going to say, oh, I'm so glad for you, and how can I help you? And if you need to go to the treatment center, can I watch your kids? But I don't know that we're at a place where that woman is going to say to her neighbor, no matter how much she respects her, you know, my husband has had 3 affairs and looked at about, you know, 20 hours of webcam porn in the last 2 weeks, and I think he needs some. I mean, I just don't think that people are as likely to talk about this or get help for it because it feels so shameful. And if you're not out there looking for help or seeing who else is looking for help, then how would you know how many people really do have this problem? And it's funny, you know, as a sex addict, I have to say, I remember going into environments where, you know, whether it was a bathhouse or some anonymous sex place or a bookstore, whatever it was back in my day, and thinking, oh, I'm the only one with this problem. Now, there were people all around me who were having sex with strangers or doing whatever. I didn't think of them as having a problem. I felt like I was the only one, even though every time I went to these places, there were 50 people or 100 people or whatever it was, all doing this crazy sexual stuff. It takes walking to a room with other dads, other gay guys, other lesbians, other people who are like you, who are ashamed and feel like they don't know what to do, and talking in a very clear way about sex and about what you want to change, knowing you're not going to be judged and you're going to be supported and you're going to get help. It takes that motivation and willingness for change to occur. And when you do that, you will find out that, yes, 1 in 10, something like that, addicts certainly is struggling with sex addiction. And, you know, a good percentage of the population. Let me just say this to you. You may ask me, well, how many people are sex addicts? You know, how many sex addicts do we have? And I'm going to say to you, well, how many alcoholics do we have? Because we don't know. You know, lots of people go home and get drunk and pass out every night, but they make it to work the next day. And they get through the day and they go home and get drunk that night. And, you know, they most certainly are alcoholics, but they're functional alcoholics. So they don't come to us for help because they're somehow getting by. They don't believe or want to believe they have a problem, and they want to keep drinking. And so those people will never get help, or they won't until they get arrested and they're ordered to help or something like that. And it's not any different for sex addiction, you know, except that with sex addiction, it's more shameful. It's more embarrassing. It's a joke, you know. Oh yeah, that's what I want to be, a sex addict. No, you don't. That's like saying you want to be an alcoholic and drive into trees. You know, you may like drinking. That's okay. And sex is okay too. But sex in the way that sex addicts carry it out is like driving drunk. You know, you just don't want to be that person.
So thank you so much, Rob. This has been really interesting. I've certainly learned a lot.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
I don't ever tire of talking about this because someone needs to be talking about it, you know.
Mhm.
And you guys know, whether you choose to put this in the piece or not, that most people who are sent to an addiction center or a mental health center are never asked about masturbation. They're never asked about affairs. They're never asked about porn. And yet, when we assess people when they come into treatment, we ask them about eating, we ask them about exercise, we ask them about education, we ask them about their bodies, their family life, but we don't, it is not written into into therapy assessments to ask specifically about sex. But we ask about everything else. And I have a feeling that's more of a cultural bias that needs to change, because if you eat, you go to the bathroom, you know. And if you have hormones and you are built like an adult, you probably have sex. And so, you know, and if you are a human being, you probably eat occasionally. So why can we ask about all the other stuff and not ask about sex? And I think that's on our therapeutic community to have a better relationship and comfort level in talking about sex, because my experience is even the non-sex addicts, the ones who've just had an affair or looked at a little porn, or maybe they did something in Vegas 3 years ago at a conference, they want to talk about it too. But if we don't ask, they'll never talk about it. They're dying for us to ask. We just don't. So I would say courage to all of you people out there who want to talk about this or feel you need to talk about this. And if your therapist doesn't feel comfortable or isn't in a place, find someone who is. Talk to these ladies. I'm sure they are more than glad to comfortably and with a lot of support allow you to talk about things that you think you don't ever want to talk about with anyone. And so one of the things that I just want to close with is a statement that Pat Carnes, my mentor and friend, made and makes often, which is that sexual secrets are often the ones that cause us the most pain and the most heartache, and yet they're the ones that we are least likely to talk about. And I think it takes the right therapist and a courageous treatment environment to say, there's nothing we can't talk about here. You know, that we're human beings. We poop, we eat, we have sex, and all of it could be good or some of it could be problematic. And we got to talk about all of it, because good therapists and good addiction people understand that it isn't just one thing in your life that's causing the problem. It's your whole life that's the problem. And we've got to look at all of it, including sex and love, in order to make sure that you stay well, no matter what the issue is. And with that, I just want to say, what a pleasure to have you guys let me ramble at you for all this time. Um, and I would appreciate if you can make available maybe my website or some of the S meetings websites, or in the rooms, or places where people can, when they see this, they can actually go to your site or whatever and click and say, okay, I saw that here. I want to get more information or help.
Go to kilobyscenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, to see the full schedule of speakers and to register to watch these free online September 23rd and 24th in the Radical Recovery Summit 2017.